So today we're going to tackle a really big topic, systemic racial inequality. But we're going to do it by skipping the opinions and instead just follow the data. We're going to look at what the social science research actually says. Let's dive in. Here's our roadmap. First, we're going to get on the same page about a foundational concept. Then we'll look at the hard data in three key areas: the justice system, the economy through hiring and housing, and the wealth gap that comes out of all that. And finally, we'll connect all the dots to see how this becomes a compounding problem.
All right, so to really dig into this, we've got to start with a key definition provided in our source material.
The source material defines this as the unearned advantages that white people may experience. Now, the key thing to get here is that this isn't about saying someone's had an easy life or that they haven't faced hardship. The argument is that their race itself isn't one of the barriers they have to overcome.
Okay, so with that idea on the table, let's turn to our first big pile of evidence, the criminal justice system.
What the research uncovered is pretty stark. It suggests that racial bias creates disadvantages for minorities at pretty much every step of the way, from an initial police stop all the way through to sentencing.
So to really get a sense of the scale here, just look at this number. The data shows Black Americans are put in state prisons at 5 times the rate of white Americans. That's a huge disparity, and it really sets the stage for what we're looking at.
And what's really telling is that if you look at kids in the juvenile justice system, the gap is even bigger. Black youth are incarcerated at 5.6 times the rate of white youth, which tells you that these patterns, well, they start young.
And it's not just about who ends up in prison, right? The research points to a pattern at every single step. For instance, data shows Black and Hispanic drivers are just more likely to get searched during a traffic stop. And when it comes to things like pretrial detention for similar offenses, people of color often get dealt a tougher hand.
Okay, so that's the justice system. Now let's pivot and look at the economic side of things, specifically the barriers people might face when trying to get a job or a house.
A really well-known hiring study from sociologist Deva Pager turned up a result that, honestly, it's pretty shocking. She sent out pairs of guys to apply for jobs. The finding? A white applicant with a criminal record actually got more callbacks than an equally qualified Black applicant without one.
And get this, that bias can kick in before anyone even walks in the door for an interview. This landmark study sent out thousands of identical resumes. The only thing they changed was the name at the top. The resumes with white-sounding names got 50% more callbacks. That shows the barrier can pop up at the very first hurdle.
You know, the story doesn't stop with getting a job. It extends right into housing. And this is so critical because for most American families, their house is the #1 way they build wealth.
I mean, you can literally draw a line from the past to the present. Decades ago, you had official policies like redlining, which blocked off entire minority neighborhoods from getting mortgages. Well, that legacy is still with us. Today, data shows Black and Latino applicants get denied for mortgages at higher rates, even with similar finances. And a recent study found that homes in Black neighborhoods are consistently appraised for less, leading to a cumulative loss of over $160 billion in equity.
And here's the really crucial part. None of this stuff happens in a vacuum. These issues aren't separate problems. They stack up. And that brings us to the persistent racial wealth gap.
So how does it all connect? Well, think about it. A criminal record makes it way harder to get a job. Your job determines your income. Your income determines whether you can buy a home. And that home is the cornerstone of building wealth for your family. See, it's all linked.
And the end result of all these connections is a pretty staggering number. According to the data, the median wealth gap between a white household and a Black household is over $240,000. And what's maybe even more concerning is that the source notes this gap has actually been getting wider, not smaller.
A huge piece of this puzzle is what's called intergenerational wealth, basically money and assets passed down through families. Because wealth has been concentrated in white communities for so long, white families today are almost 4 times more likely to get an inheritance. That's a huge head start that just perpetuates the advantage into the next generation.
So all of this brings us to the main takeaway. The argument isn't that these are just separate, unlucky events. It's that they form a compounding cycle where one disadvantage actually fuels the next one.
You can kind of trace the path, right? It often starts with disparities in education. That can lead to barriers in the workforce, which then get compounded by the biases in hiring and housing we just talked about. And the final result? That massive, persistent wealth gap that gets passed down from one generation to the next.
So, if there's one thing to take away from all this data, it's this. The argument presented is that this isn't just about a few isolated incidents. It's about a system where disadvantages can accumulate, one on top of the other over time and even across generations. It creates a cycle that can be incredibly hard to break.
And that leaves all of us with a pretty big question to think about, based on the evidence we've just walked through. What does equality of opportunity really mean, if the data suggests from the very beginning people are starting from different places on the track?